Alright guys, so welcome to another video lesson. I apologize for these going up a little bit late, but they're up a little late because I wanted to do them all as one big topic instead of separating it in days like I did for class. So if you're in the live class, this is from Wednesday's lesson and Thursday's lesson all in one video. So it's going to change presentations halfway through, but it's the same objective. The key terms will change and that's about it. So make sure you get the objective, make sure you get the key terms, and we're going to move on. So let's get started. Shaping a new republic. You already have the objective. Key point 1. So George Washington was unanimously chosen as the first president of the United States. During this early era in U.S. history, there were no systems in place for how to govern, meaning that anything he did would be replicated, would be followed. People didn't have a guide. He was going to have to make it up on the fly. Nobody knew what a president was. They knew what a king was. They knew what a king could do. Nobody knew what a president could do. So it was going to be a really big deal for him to advance and move forward. So you don't need to write any info down on the first Congress, or any of the Congresses for that matter. I just want to show you the look, right? So what you see here, most of it is held by the Federalists, and there is a small group that are known as anti-administration. That's because Washington doesn't like political parties, and there are none during his presidency. So the Federalists, which are his party, which again, he didn't like them, he didn't identify as that, but that's what we know him as. That's what they were. So that's all it is. You just need to look at that. And again, you don't need to write this down. Just know Washington was unanimously elected and John Adams became his vice president. So now here we go. Washington as president. Again, unanimously elected. He was dragged out of retirement. He did not want this job. It was not a job he wanted, but it was a job he took because people needed him and wanted him. He established lower federal courts, each state getting its own, with the Judiciary Act of 1789. It's a big deal. He led federal troops to enforce federal law during the Whiskey Rebellion. And for his foreign policy, he had to deal with the French Revolution, the Jay Treaty, and the Pinckney Treaty all at the same time. So we're going to get into those in more detail moving forward, but just know that. This is like the rundown slide of what he did. So pause if you need time. We're moving forward. Let's talk about the cabinet. So Washington, the first president, also created the first cabinet. Doesn't matter what type of president you are, whether you're George Washington, whether you're Abe Lincoln, Ronald Reagan, or Donald Trump. Doesn't matter who you are as a president. You are a person. You are a normal human person. And you cannot possibly know everything about everything. You may be good at some things, right? Like if you're Washington, you're probably a pretty good general. You're probably pretty good at being even killed. But you need other people around you that are experts so you can make expert decisions because you're a leader. That's what good leaders do. So Washington brings on a cabinet, a group of advisors. They're like his team. They're his backup. They're his buddies. And they help him make decisions. Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, first one. Secretary of Treasury, you all know, Hamilton, Alexander Hamilton. Secretary of War. Back then we had a Secretary of War. Now it's a different position. It's called the Defense. But back then it was the War, and it was Henry Knox, a revolutionary friend of Washington's, and then Attorney General, right, like head attorney, person who in charge of laws, Edmund Randolph. So just make sure you get their names and their job for Washington's cabinet. Again, you don't need to write anything here, but just note the anti-administration is growing a little bit. There's a few more coming into the next Congress. So, key point 2. Needed a breath there. Alexander Hamilton proposes creating a national bank collecting tariffs and excise taxes and having the federal government assume the debt incurred by each state in order to deal with the early nation's financial struggles. So the United States early on is struggling to pay for things and will struggle and would have drowned if it wasn't for Hamilton's plan. So Hamilton's financial plan, it breaks into 4 parts. First, he needs to, well actually before we get into the 4 parts, let's talk about the debt, or the problem. So America is $75 million in debt, and that's way more now than it would have been then. Or it's way more, like it's worth way more now. It was a lot of money then, it's a lot of money now, but now imagine it being even more. The national currency is worthless, and we have no foreign credit, meaning that other countries won't give us money because they don't think we're worth paying it back. So, comes up with a debt plan. First thing he's going to do, federal government's going to assume the state debts, meaning that the states are going to owe money to the federal government. He's also going to create a national bank. The reason he does that, by the way, is so that way the U.S. gets more credit. So the other countries will see, oh, U.S. people owe you money? Okay, well, here, have some money because we know that you're good for it because, you're owed money. Economics is weird. Create a national bank to manage revenue and currency. It's a private institution. Keep that in mind. Sources of revenue through tariffs and taxes. He's going to make the government money through taxes and tariffs, things that not a lot of people like. And he is going to help protect domestic industry. So there were plenty of opposition, mainly led by Jefferson and Madison, who felt it was unconstitutional, who felt it was too favorable of bankers and northern merchants and not favorable enough of farmers and Westerners. And the compromise was done at is known as the dinner table bargain, right? The room where it happened. And the plan will be approved in order for the national to be built in the South in Washington, D.C., the national capital, that is. So you need the 4 points, you need the problems, and you need to know the resolution. That's about it. So we're going to move forward. Let's talk about the Whiskey Rebellion. This was a bit of a stain. Not a stain so much, but a problem that Washington will deal with, domestically speaking. As part of Hamilton's plan, there will be an excise tax on domestically made whiskey. And basically, whiskey is the only way a farmer makes a lot of profit. They take their excess rye and turn it into whiskey. Well, taxing it upsets a lot of farmers, and they end up, rebelling. They attack federal courthouses and tax collectors and try to set stuff on fire and burn everything down. So Washington will lead federal troops and quash or crush and destroy the rebels. This asserts federal authority over lawlessness. The public could denounce and protest the laws, but they could not violate and rebel and fight and all that stuff. You could be mad at the law, but you couldn't just go and rebel because you didn't like it. He used federal troops to enforce federal law. It's an important one to note. So, Jefferson and the opposition. Jefferson and the people that agreed with him felt that this was an overuse of military power, and they catered to Western farmers specifically, so they felt like they were being wrongfully mistreated. So, next election, again, Washington wins unanimously. John Adams is again the vice president. Keep everything the same. Third Congress, you see more and more of the anti-administration, and in fact, by the time the Third Congress comes around, they're in the majority in the House. Not in the Senate, but in the House, meaning that Federalists are losing ground. There's a lot of rural farmers out there that really like what the anti-administration has to say. Again, they're not a real political party yet. They're just not members of the Federalist Party. All right, let's move forward. This is the Fourth Congress. Again, that grows even more. You see more and more of a domination. And by the time you get the Fourth Congress, now these groups have a name. They're the Democratic Republicans, and we'll get into them in a little bit. So, next key point, Washington's presidency deals with major struggles, including how to react to foreign wars in Europe while still handling domestic issues at the same time. So Washington's going to struggle with this presidential idea, this thing of how do I deal with the foreign stuff and not let it affect my domestic policy, right? This thing's happening at home. And spoilers, you can't really do that. It's hard to do. So, we're not going to talk about this here because we're talking about it more tomorrow. So we're going to skip the foreign policy and move on to his precedents. So, Washington dealt with a lot of issues. But his leadership and his foresight, because it was foresight to know that people would look to him afterwards to see what it was to be a president, what your job was, what your responsibilities were, what you had to do, led him to being very careful and very limited in the powers he used. He only served 2 terms by choice. He stepped down after his second term. He came up with the term Mr. President. There was all these questions what do you call a president? Do we call him his royalness, his excellency, his nobleness? They didn't know what to call him. So it was just, hey, just Mr. President. Creating a cabinet was something he did, right? We talked about that already. Staying neutral, the idea of neutrality, is something he also was a big, big fan of. He wore civilian clothes even though he was a soldier and could have very easily worn a uniform. He set that precedent of like, hey, you're a man of the people, you dress like the people. And then giving a farewell address, which is like a goodbye. And again, we'll get into the farewell address on the next set of slides. So that's about it for here. So pause this, make sure your notes are ready. We're going into what would have been day 2. So this is the same video. It's not another video, so just give it time and we're going to get into day 2. Alright guys, so this is the day 2 part, same video, same topic, same objective, but different material. So there's new key terms you might want to get. New key terms. And we're going to move on. So we're shaping a new republic still. So Washington's presidency dealt with foreign issues with both France and Great Britain. A lot of them. So we're going to get into those. First ones we're going to talk about is tensions with France. So France is a strong ally of the United States. They're kind of like our only friend. But that alliance was made with Louis XVI of France, the king. And during this time, there's a very, very bloody revolution in France going on. And the people of France that are governing, in quotes, right, wanted help fighting other European powers from the United States. The king had already lost his head, and Americans felt like they didn't owe the new government any money, or any help, I should say, whereas the French people did. They were like, hey, we helped you be independent from the king, help us do the same thing, but the Americans are kind of like, they're really reluctant, and by this time in Europe, like if you're still supporting the French Revolution, you're kind of like okay with people getting their heads chopped off because it was happening a lot. So it's not a good sign, and Washington has to deal with this, and his answer basically is to avoid it. He's going to stay neutral. He's going to declare neutrality. Now, what's going on with Britain is that the U.S. obviously had just finished fighting a war with Britain, so Britain's not the happiest with them overall. Britain is still in North America as far as troops. They have troops in North America still. Britain was still impressing American sailors at sea. This isn't impressing, by the way. You need to write this. Impressing doesn't mean like, hey, that's cool. Impressing sailors means that you capture them and enslave them, or not enslave them, capture them and force them to work on your ship as the Navy. So basically, Britain was capturing American ships, capturing the people on those ships, and forcing them to serve time in the British Navy, making them British sailors. And as you can guess, Americans didn't like this. If you were a young American and you were working on a merchant ship trying to trade and do all that stuff, you had a good chance of being captured by the British and made into the Navy. And it's not exactly a good thing. So Americans were calling for war and answers. They wanted to know what was going on with this. They wanted answers. They wanted this dealt with. And Washington will send John Jay over to Britain to negotiate, and they come up with this treaty. But the treaty's really vague on the act of impressing sailors, and so not much happens. Basically, they sign a treaty. Hey, let's be friends. This treaty signed. Nothing really gets done. Britain is still going to be impressing sailors. This issue is going to get pressed on to the next guy in line to be president. So, let's talk about Washington's actual plans and policy, shall we? So, first side, you got France, America's only friend. They got the French Revolution going on. So people uprooting the government, violence in the street, headless nobles and kings. Not a good look, not a good thing to be associated with. Americans didn't trust the lack of a central government and felt like they owed the king, not the people. So because of this, Washington will declare neutrality. There will be a declaration of neutrality signed by him that will be put into effect, and the United States is going to stay out of this. All right. Now the French, by the way, were favored by this group, which is Bell, which are the Democratic Republicans. This is their symbol, their logo. Now Britain, America's first big enemy, right? They kind of are, right? We're the ones that fought with them. The Navy is capturing American sailors and forcing them in. That's impressment. That's what that's called. And Americans are angry, super, very, very super angry, and they dislike this. The Federalists, by the way, are in favor of supporting Britain. They're big fans of them, and the Federalists kind of saw that Democratic Republican logo and just kind of copied it and made their own. It's kind of weird, but that's what happened. But anyways, This is Washington's plan for that is the Jay Treaty, a treaty that doesn't really solve the issue. So neutral in one, not solved issue in the other. And that's kind of where Washington stands, and that's where he leaves this foreign policy issue. So now you get one of the last precedents that he sets for presidents to follow, and it's his farewell address. Another bell. And basically what that is it's Washington saying goodbye to the people of the U.S. Right? There's no real way for him to do that during this time, so it's this speech, and it's a speech that's going to be printed all over the place. That photo that's in there is one from 1811, just to put in perspective. So Washington gives his goodbye speech as president as he leaves after 2 terms. And he warns the Americans about a bunch of stuff, but specifically 2 things. And he says, avoid political parties. It will split you into sections. And he doesn't want that. He also says, avoid foreign conflicts. Stay neutral whenever possible and avoid alliances because that will lead to you getting into wars you shouldn't be fighting. And those are the 2 big ones that he talks about. Those are the 2 main issues that he's concerned about. So, those are his warnings that he says. Next key point. Under Washington's nose, right after he leaves office, so it's happening already even while he's in office, right? Anti-administration. It's already happening, but right after he leaves, Hamilton and Jefferson form the first 2 political parties in the United States. Hamilton's is known as the Federalists. They had strong national government. They were a big fan of strong national government. They had federal policies that supported the federal government as a whole. Constructionalists hold that. We'll get there in a bit. They believed in commerce and manufacturing, which means trade and making stuff. They're very urban, very popular in cities. They were typically the noble, like bankers and not noble, sorry, like the bankers and merchants and wealthy are who supported Federalists. They were pro-British, anti-French Revolution, and don't worry about Northeast, you don't need that. Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson, were for states' rights, not federal. They believed in stronger state governments that had more autonomy. Again, we're going to do this at the end. They were more agricultural. They were big fans of farming, rural, not towns, not cities, but farmland. Small farmers, plantation owners, artisans, also like frontiers people tended to lean Democratic Republican. They were anti-British and pro-French Revolution. They were typically in the West and in the South. Now, Constructionalist. Constructionalist is another way of saying like interpretation of the Constitution. So a constructionalist is like how you view the Constitution, right? It's how you interpret it. Strict means that you follow it to the word. If it doesn't say you can't do it, whatever the Constitution says, you do. And whatever it doesn't say, you don't do. Loose constructionalist or loose interpretation means that you can do things that it doesn't tell you not to do. So to put that into perspective, I know that sounds confusing. Hamilton being a loose interpretist, he believes that the Constitution allows him to create a national bank. And the reason he believes that is because the Constitution doesn't tell him he can't. Whereas Jefferson, who is a strict constructionalist, will say, hold on a minute. If the Constitution doesn't give you the power, it doesn't say, hey, you, Hamilton, can make national banks, then you can't do it. It doesn't say it, you can't do it. Whereas Hamilton says, yeah, but it doesn't say I can't do it, therefore I can. That's the way that these 2 people looked at the Constitution. Loose, it doesn't say I can't do it, so I can. Strict, it doesn't say you can do it, so you can't. And that's a good way to keep that in mind. So you might want to write those separately on their own. Probably going to need to play this back a few times, but just keep that in mind. You need that in there. You need it. You got to know that. All right, so not much to say here other than John Adams wins the presidency after Washington leaves. I almost said Lincoln. And Jefferson will become his vice president. So you're going to have 2 opposing sides of the political spectrum serving as president and vice president. This is an issue. This is why eventually it will go away. So, sorry, wrong. What am I doing? I'm doing something wrong here. All right, there we go. I figured it out. I skipped a key point. So, John Adams was the 2nd president of the U.S. His served 1 term because he wasn't elected for a second. And his presidency was plagued by foreign issues and troubles. What am I doing? All right. So, He was a Federalist from 1797 to 1801. That's his term, one term. Unpopular in his time, but partially appreciated after. So there's a level of appreciation you can give to Adams for keeping us out of war with France, because that's what he did. That is his masterpiece, keeping us out of war with France. I couldn't think of a word there. So, and there was issues for that because we were pretty much going to go to war with France over two issues. First one being this, the XYZ affair. So, background. You don't need to write this. This is just background. This is context for you to know. The United States, for a very long time, for as long as they've been around pretty much, it seems, with this, has always had this idea, and European nations kind of don't like this and kind of hate it, that, hey, America will declare itself neutral in the war you're fighting. Right? We're neutral. We're not going to get involved. But we are going to stay neutral and trade with you and with your enemy. Right? We're going to trade with everybody regardless of our neutrality. So they built this habit during this era, and they keep it, and they kept it for a long, they'll keep it into the world wars. And during this time, America can't defend their ships, to put it in, like, there's nothing that, like, America's not scary. America's brand new. It's a little baby in a carriage of a country. A country like France, even though they're in the middle of a revolution, is not worried about the United States and its power. So, what do they do when Americans start selling to the British and to the French? Well, they start capturing American ships too, the way the British have always been. And like, whoa, this is an issue, right? So John Adams will send a delegation to France, including John Marshall, Eldridge Gerry, and Charles Pinckney. And when they get there, they're like, hey, can we speak to the French foreign minister? But there are 3 French delegates that they meet, and these 3 delegates demand a bribe of the Americans. They say, you must pay us $10 million in order to meet the French foreign minister. And the Americans are outraged. They're like, what? They're so outraged, guys, that we don't know these people's name. The Americans refuse to name them. That's why it's the XYZ affair. They're known as X, Y, and Z. And when the word gets back to the United States that this happened, Americans are outraged, like offended. It's an offense. You don't take us seriously enough to just talk to us. You wouldn't do this to Britain. And the French are like, you're right, we wouldn't. But you're not Britain, right? You don't have the best navy in the world. You're just a tiny little baby country. So the Americans are outraged, and near the brink of war, there's an era known as the Phony War we're not going to get into. But basically, Americans all want to go to war, and John Adams has to like fight tooth and nail to keep us out of war. But during this time period, the near wartime period, is enough for something not so great to happen, and this is definitely the worst thing that a president, I feel, has ever done, or at least one of them. I take that back. It's not the worst thing a president has ever done, but it is very, very, it is up there. It is in the top, it is in the echelon of some of the horrible things the president has done. Because plenty of presidents have done plenty of bad things, but this is pretty up there. This is before, by the way, the Supreme Court has power, so keep that in mind. The Supreme Court doesn't have judicial review yet. The Federalist Party, through Adams, will pass 2 laws. The Alien Act and Sedition Act. So the Alien Act targets immigrants. It makes it harder and makes it take longer for people to become citizens in the United States. And it also gives the president power to deport any immigrant they want, regardless of citizenship, for any reason. This is intended to hurt the Democratic Republicans, who tended to be really good or popular among immigrants. Immigrants would get to the United States and like the Democratic Republican slogans much more than the Federalists. And so that's the Alien Act. If you think ICE is bad, that is worse. Trust me. And the Sedition Act is somehow worse than that. And it basically fines and imprisons anyone conspiring with intent to oppose laws of the government, or, and this is the worst part, spreading opposition through printing, writing, or speaking against the government of the U.S., Congress, or the president. So speaking against the president, talking about it, right? Writing about it, anything like that, could get you imprisoned or fined. This violates the First Amendment. And this couldn't happen today because right away the Supreme Court would be like, you can't do that. That's unconstitutional. But during this time, there is a Supreme Court, but they don't have judicial review yet, which is the power that lets them do that. So because they don't have that power, these acts get through and they're passed, and they're in the books. And I forget his name, but there was even a U.S. congressman that is arrested and put in prison, and he still wins his election, by the way, while in prison. That's how unpopular these acts were. So the people hated these, so much so that Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans are going to get power over the government like entirely through voting. And the Alien Act will be repealed and the Sedition Act will expire, and they will go away and they won't be used anymore to harm any more would-be Americans. Now, these acts are very unpopular, so once you get this info down, we're moving in to these two laws. These are going to come back. This is a historic connection, the Virginia Resolution and Kentucky Resolution. They're secretly written by the Vice President, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. And they urge states to nullify or void federal laws that they disagree with. This is a symbolic gesture. There's no judicial review. Nothing happens. But these are going to come back to hurt people. This is a connection to the nullification crisis in 1832. So just write down, this is a historical connection to the nullification crisis of 1832, where states feel they have the right to ignore federal laws that they disagree with. And when we get to the nullification crisis, we're going to talk about how plenty of presidents are like, no, you don't. But this starts here. It starts here. So that is the connection. You need to know that. And that is pretty much it. Next comes the election or revolution of 1800. And all you need to know about this is it is a peaceful transfer of power from one political group to another. All right, so John Adams, who's a Federalist, loses. And regardless of who he loses to, even though he loses to Jefferson, right, but whether it was Jefferson or Burr, he loses his seat, and he peacefully, very calmly, very tranquilly transfers power over to the next political group. It's probably the best thing that he did. It's probably even better than the keeping us out of war with France. It's probably the best thing that he did because it, again, sets a precedent for the future. So, this exit ticket and the other one from day one are on Google Classroom. If you're watching this video for the first time, make sure you get those done and submitted, even if they're late. They'll still count. Just let me know that you're out that day. You're waiting on the video. So, that is it for me, guys. The next video will be a shorter, very short actually, probably very few, couple of minutes, about the society that we covered on Friday, which is today if you're watching this same day. All right, guys, have a great day. Have a great weekend. See y'all.